This morning we're still going to be in chapter 1 of Daniel before we move on. And there's so much here that we need to continue to go over and get a good understanding of. And so far we have said that the book of Daniel sets out to answer the two questions that the Jews would have had, and that those two questions that are questions that we may even ask today, and that is, if you would, is there God truly God as compared with the Babylonian God? And then also the other question would be, if you would, will God forgive the sin of His people and resume fellowship with them? And so that's basically what the book of Daniel is set out to try and answer for the people of the time, and also for us today. And as a matter of fact, those are questions that we constantly are probably finding ourselves asking, even though we don't really understand that those are the questions we ask. That being, if you would, is our God truly God, and then will He forgive and redeem us? Because many of the times we ask questions and don't really understand that the questions we're asking, like, where is God? Why did this happen? Is basically asking those same questions. And the Jews at this point in time might even be asking an even deeper question than that, and that would be, if you would, can He redeem us? All right? I mean, after all, in their minds, the Babylonian God was stronger than God Almighty. At that point in time, if your nation fell, that meant the other nation's God was more powerful than your God. So they may even be asking themselves at this point in time, even can He redeem us? I mean, after all, we were defeated. And so, as we begin to continue through Daniel and try and remember that those are the questions that are being dealt with along the way, we're going to pick up today in part of the passage we've already read several times, just reading Daniel 1, verse 5, if you would. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter into the king's service. Okay, so as we talked about last week, they are beginning the process, if you would, changing these youths' names and re-educating them in an effort to strip them of their Jewish identity and make them loyal Babylonians. Okay, this included even their diet, that they wanted them to begin to not just think like Babylonians, they want them to begin to act like Babylonians. They want them to eat the Babylonian foods and so on. And so we find in this situation that Daniel, on the behalf of his companions and himself, speaks up, picking up in verse 8, if you would. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of the Lord, my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please, test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. Now, I can't tell you what Daniel and his companions would have done if the guard would have said no. But Daniel appears to be determined to remain faithful to God and has no intention of becoming Babylonian. I mean, after all, the word resolved is a pretty firm word, isn't it? Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that the reason the exile has taken place is because the Jews in general have basically forsaken God. They've been worshiping idols and everything. But what we get from this section of the passage here is that Daniel and his companions have not followed after that. They are determined to remain faithful to God. They are determined to not be defiled. And that's interesting, because one of the things we talked about at the very beginning when we first started this study, that we have a tendency to take a moralistic view of Daniel, and we look at the Bible stories and just be good, be like Daniel and his companions, and be like them and everything, and all will go well. And the idea being that if you're being faithful to God, everything's going to go well for you. As long as you're just a good little follower, things are going to be good. Well, look what being a good little follower has gotten Daniel and his companions. They're exiled. They've been castrated. They're getting ready to be re-educated. That's what being good did for them. And so we need to understand that being good followers of Christ does not mean the bad things are not going to happen to us as a consequence of things going on around us. So as we're looking at this passage, like I said, that word resolved is a pretty firm word. He's resolved, I am not going to do this one way or another. But keep in mind that some of the food would have probably been considered clean under other circumstances, including the wine. But the otherwise clean foods, such as the beef or things like that would have been offered, were not properly prepared in order for them to be considered clean and acceptable. There was a specific way that they had to prepare their food. And also, once the food was prepared, it was also defiled further in that, if you would, the first of the food was offered on an altar to the Babylonian gods and was therefore defiled. So you've got that going on, which means that even what would have otherwise been acceptable for them to eat, because of those two things, they couldn't eat them as well. And then also, if you would, the first of the wine would have also been poured out on an altar to the gods and would have all been defiled also. And so here they are, they're in this situation, these foods that would probably back home been okay to eat because they had been properly prepared, not offered to idols and things, but they can't eat those either. And so Daniel politely raises his objections, and we see God at work in the situation. Notice there in verse 9, if you would. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Interesting how we've got some parallels going on here. Just as he was with Joseph when he was in prison and moved the officials to show favor to Joseph, God was with Daniel and moved the guard to show favor toward him. Under normal circumstances, the guard would have probably said, nope, can't do that. This is the way it goes. You're here now. You do things our way. But because God was with Daniel and moved the guard to be favorable toward him, the guard's reply gave Daniel the opportunity to offer an alternative. Notice the wisdom that Daniel already seems to have. The guard gives the opportunity, and so Daniel comes up with the alternative. He didn't try to butt heads with him. He didn't say, well, we're Jews and we just can't do this. This is just not going to happen. No. Daniel wisely took the situation in hand, and instead, if you would, Daniel wisely offered the guard an option to grant Daniel's request and not risk losing his life. In other words, hey, I understand how you feel. Well, how about we do this? That way you won't get in trouble, and we can show you that we're going to be just as healthy as everyone else. For the guard, the food itself wasn't the issue. He really didn't care what they ate as long as they were healthy when they were brought before the king. As far as he's concerned, they could go out and eat mud as long as they were healthy. And so we pick up in verse 14 where we read, so he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. And so we are continually seeing, even from the very beginning of Daniel, God is at work. Okay? They were probably, like I said, they were asking those questions. Is our God really God? Can He, will He redeem us and resume fellowship with us? And these questions going through their mind, and yet we see from the very beginning of Daniel, all through even just the first chapter, God is at work. They're thinking their God has been defeated. No, their God wasn't defeated. God delivered them into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. They are there because God is at work, because God is judging. Like we talked about last week, it is so appropriate that Daniel is the one who is writing this book, because his name means God is my judge. And the book of Daniel over and over shows us God judging His people and the captors of His people. So with God's help, Daniel has managed to get the guard to change their diet to one that would be acceptable to God, and now their 3 years of training begins. And so we pick up at verse 18. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. So after 3 years, all of the selected exiles are brought before the king, and he questions them. He wants to see how well they've learned, how well they've done. And Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah proved to be at the top of the class. Not only that, they are, if you would, 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And that's interesting. 10 times better than those who have been in the king's service for years. They've only had 3 years of training. So, this is kind of a wow situation. You can almost begin to picture Nebuchadnezzar questioning them, and he's beginning to realize, wow, these guys got it more on the ball than all my people do. Why? Well, because they really picked up on that Babylonian stuff so well. They just learned it all in 3 years. No. This is the occult the Babylonians were teaching them. And remember, Daniel is determined to stay faithful to God. They were learning occult practices. So why is it they are 10 times better? Let's look back a few verses again. Verse 17. To these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So why? If you would, because God gave them knowledge and understanding. And notice, not just knowledge and understanding of the Babylonian teachings. God gave them knowledge and understanding, if you would, of all kinds of literature and learning. These guys were more intelligent, more educated, understood more about the world going on around them, even beyond the boundaries of Babylon. These have proven to be the kind of guys that you would definitely want to have as your advisors, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Why? Because they've got a better grasp of what's going on in the world than all of the people that you've gathered around you for the last however many years. Because God was with them. And what God gave them went far beyond anything the Babylonians could have taught them. Because what took place is, if you would, God gave them a supernatural understanding. This wasn't something they learned from the Babylonians. This was a gift from God. And He gifted Daniel so that, if you would, he could understand visions and dreams. Another parallel with Joseph. We see God at work. Like we talked about last week, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are here for a reason. They were selected among the exiles for a reason. And God is putting things in place because He is going to be at work throughout this entire period. This wasn't just about punishing the people of Judah. God is going to be judging and revealing Himself to the Gentiles, the Babylonians. And He is going to work through these 4 young men. And He has set them apart, given them special gifts of knowledge and understanding. Daniel to be able to have visions and interpret dreams. God is putting everything in place for His plan to reveal He is God Almighty. He did not bow down to the Babylonian gods. Rather, He is using the Babylonians to his glory. One, to punish his people and cleanse them. And two, to reveal his power and might to the Babylonians. So, what's happened so far? Well, about the time that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah have completed their education in the covenant community of Judah, if you would, Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians, and many are carried off into exile. Okay? And it probably took about a year for them to arrive in Babylon, maybe longer. So, try and imagine, not only has your nation fallen and your capital city fallen, now you are being marched for over a year to your new destination through some very harsh conditions. And upon their arrival in Babylon, which is approximately a year later, maybe a little bit more, if you would, several are selected from the royal family and nobility to receive a special 3-year education. Of course, like we've talked about, this is a re-education to strip them of their identity and make them into good, loyal Babylonian citizens. Send them to that government-run school so we can train them up to be what we want them to be. Teach them what to think, teach them how to think, teach them how to act. Make them good, faithful Babylonian citizens. And at the end of 3 years, they're brought before the king, and he finds that, if you would, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah have excelled far above the rest. And not only that, if you would, they are 10 times better than anyone else among all the magicians and enchanters in their knowledge and understanding. God's already been doing some pretty incredible stuff. And this is just the beginning of Daniel. God is already exhibiting his power and his might and his control over things. And you're probably thinking, we've been spending a lot of time in the first chapter, and we have been. And that's because everything that follows in Daniel is directly impacted by what has taken place in this first chapter. See, this first chapter is the prologue to the rest of the book of Daniel, and understanding what is happening in this first chapter is essential to really understanding the rest of the book and what happens. Because remember, chapters 1 through 6 are more than just moralistic Bible stories. I mean, we have a tendency to reduce them to that, but they're more than that. If you would, there is a message for God's people in every generation. And we're going to look at that message as we go through. So for now, 4 years have passed, and Daniel and his companions have exceeded everyone's expectations. Keep in mind, the typical mindset of the people of this period is, if we have conquered you and your God, then you are inferior to us. And so in their minds, there's no possible way you will ever be quite as educated as we are. But we're going to give you the blessing of our education and try and improve your situation. Try and make things a little bit better for you. After all, we're the superior people. We won. And then along come these 4 guys, and they're 10 times better than any Babylonian. Think about that. Because that does impact things in the book of Daniel, as we will go through and find later on. Next week, we're going to see something very interesting that I think almost everyone misses when they read through the book of Daniel. And I'm not going to give you a spoiler. I'm going to tell you what it is. But when we get into the second chapter, there's something there that I've heard messages and messages and messages and messages from Daniel, and there's something there they keep missing. And we'll take a look at that next week. And remember, that as the book of Daniel unfolds, Daniel is answering the questions, if you would. Is God really God? Is he really still in control? After all, the Babylonians defeated us. That means their God must be stronger. Is he really God? And if you would, will he forgive us and redeem us? Or even can he? The Jews had believed God had raised them up to be a great nation among nations. And now all of those beliefs have been dashed. They are struggling with identity. They're struggling with who they are, with who God is. And like we've said before, even though we can go back and read through Daniel and see this going on and understand what's happening, they're living this. They don't have the book of Daniel to look back at to help them understand what is really going on. To them, they and their God have been defeated. But as the book of Daniel is unfolding, not only has God not been defeated, he is the one who is orchestrating everything that is going on. He is the one who's putting everything into place so that he can make known that he is the true and living God. He is really God. And yes, he will forgive us and redeem us. Yes, he can do that. I've kept things a little bit short this week because I didn't want to get into the next chapter this week because there's so much there that I don't want to lose the continuity. But I think we've got a lot there just from what we've looked at over the past 3 weeks in this first chapter of Daniel to prepare us for what is beginning to unfold. One of the things that Daniel and his companions understand is regardless of the circumstances they are in, they need to trust. And they need to be obedient. Regardless of what's going on around them, they've got to remain faithful. I think that's why these 4 men were chosen. Because God knew they were going to be faithful. And he was preparing to do great things through them in the presence of the Babylonians. You know, that's interesting. We can go back through the Scriptures and over again throughout the Scriptures, especially through the Old Testament. We could ask questions constantly. Why would he ever choose that person? I mean, Moses, he was a shepherd. Why would you choose a shepherd to lead your people out of Egypt? But yet he worked through Moses in the presence of Pharaoh. Joseph. Why would you choose an arrogant teenager to preserve your people and send him ahead of them into Egypt in order to save them? Gideon. He wasn't really sure who he was. He spent most of his life hiding. And yet the angel says, "Hail, mighty warrior." And Gideon kind of looks around like, "Who are you talking to, me?" God uses those who will trust him, who will obey him, and who will allow him to work through them. And he will prepare them for the task he has at hand. As we look through this passage, we understand that God had already been preparing these 4 young men before they ever became exiles. I believe when the passage says that God gave them that supernatural understanding, that was long before they ever got to Babylon, that he had done that. He was preparing them. And he does the same today. He prepares those who will trust him and obey him. And then he works through them. Are you prepared to trust him today? Will you let him work through you? Rest assured, he's prepared you for something. Let him show you what it is.